Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Phil Beckman. Today we're joined by Charles McElwee, founding editor of RealClear Politics, RealClear Pennsylvania, Todd Shepard, chief investigative reporter with Broad and Liberty, and Rachel McDevitt, a reporter with WESA-FM in Pittsburgh. Now, yesterday, Governor Josh Shapiro signed the state budget. It's several months late. It was originally due at the end of June. It's $50.1 billion. Rachel, what did you see that you thought was interesting?
Sure. Well, of interest to me, and I've covered energy for a long time now, the Democrats traded away the option of joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. If we recall, several years ago, this was an initiative put forth by Governor Tom Wolf, wanted to join this cap and trade program that would have limited the emissions from power plants. Governor Shapiro has never been that keen on it, and he has his own plan, an alternative that he's pitched. But this was sort of final nail in the coffin for RGGI, that program that got traded away to be able to find a budget deal here. And so environmentalists are pretty upset about this being traded away. This would have been the largest climate action that Pennsylvania has ever taken. And now it's pretty much back to the drawing board for any type of emissions regulations on power plants.
Todd, what were you seeing in the budget?
Well, to just jump right in on what Rachel was saying about RGGI is I think there's a suspicion in some Republican circles that because it was coughed up at this late hour, that there may have been a sense from Democrats that the court case that is still pending on this before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, that the court case was a loser, and that the Democrats thought, well, why not try to get a little bit, like let's have a fire sale on RGGI. If we can get a few million elsewhere for sacrificing this on the altar, then it's a good deal if it ultimately would go down in the court. The other couple of things, obviously, like this is still tied into the environmental aspect, but Republicans are very excited about the permit issue and the fact that in essence, I guess you would just say a lot of that is streamlined, and they're very excited about a lot of that. And then there's the issue with cyber schools, where there was a little bit of reform on how some of those funding mechanisms are done. I know people on the right are a little disappointed on that, but I think the takeaway for them really is they've been really getting beaten up over the last couple of years over that funding imbalance. And so now it's kind of defanged to the left. They don't really have that to battle with anymore, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania has the unfortunate and concerning historical distinction of not, let's say in the past 20 years, not passing budgets in time. And we saw this yet again, right? This should have been signed in June. And really, this could be a test for Governor Shapiro in the future, because the national profiles are starting post-election. He had a successful year with the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. And the national profiles suggest his willingness to work with bipartisanship across the aisle. But there's divided government here in Harrisburg, and it's tense. So there's a gap, let's say, in the state and local presentation of the reality in Harrisburg and what is being presented in the national press. And there's another budget, of course, coming next year, and it will be before a governor's race, and not long after a memoir, from Shapiro, that likely portends something after that governor's race, a presidential run. So that will be, these budgets are more important than people realize.
Now, last week was the election day, and Democrats did very well. They won the governorships in New Jersey and Virginia, and in Pennsylvania, 3 Supreme Court justices were retained. And Charles, what were you looking for when we went into Election Day last week?
Turnout. That the Republican Party has changed. We see this realignment, but does the map of Pennsylvania today match, let's say, what either party is looking at? Is there a gap, a misalignment? So for the Republican Party, there's clearly a misalignment. Democrats outspent Republicans significantly in the judicial races, for example, and turnout let's say the turnout that was key to Trump's presidential victory in Pennsylvania in 24, that turnout was not the case in this year. And in many instances, there were Trump voters voicing discontent over, let's say, the economy, viewed local races as a national referendum and voted Democrat accordingly. And we saw fascinating outcomes like Hampton Township, not far from where we're seated here in Cumberland County, going Democrat for the first time ever. So there is a problem for the Republican Party that it was a pre-existing condition before the Trump era, and the voter registration numbers, although encouraging for the party, they don't reflect the reality of a state that is ever changing, growing, and the voters that they're targeting are not aligned with, let's say, electoral reality.
Rachel, what races were on the ballot in Allegheny County, and did you get a sense of voters were really paying attention out there?
Yeah, I think voters were paying attention. And I mean, there have certainly been a number of rallies in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area sort of leading up to it. We had a big No Kings demonstration a few weeks before that election where people were really calling for Democrats to be retained in those judicial retention elections. We saw an interesting thing in Allegheny County, and perhaps this was statewide. Forgive me if I'm not sure, but I mean the judges who cross-filed to run as Republicans and Democrats, those who cross-filed actually got a smaller share of the vote than those who registered straight as Democrats. So that was an interesting thing to see, that these candidates may be getting punished for trying to walk more of a middle line and cross-filing instead of going with one party or another. And then for the rest of, a lot of the races in Allegheny County, what we were watching, fairly predictable. The mayor's race here in Pittsburgh went with the Democrat. That big race happens in the primary. So we have Corey O'Connor incoming in the Pittsburgh mayoral office. And then I was following an interesting seat at the county council level that is an at-large seat. There's usually reserved to have one Republican at-large seat and one Democrat at-large seat for the county. And so what happened in this one was that a more traditionally Democratic liberal candidate had to file as an independent to face a Republican candidate, and that independent candidate did win that seat. So those trends, that Democratic turnout and sort of a backlash against Republicans, we saw that here as well.
Now, you also write about the impact of that on the county's Board of Elections. It means that the Republicans don't have a representative there. How is the Board of Elections, who are the members of it, and what is the impact of that?
The Board of Elections is made up of 3 county council members, and so now that will be all Democrats. The Board of Elections, like in all counties, is responsible for making sure the elections are free and fair and run efficiently in each of those counties. And I did bring that up with the candidate who won that race, Alex Rose. Does he think there would be any cause for concern if this might affect people's perception of the integrity of this board if it's dominated by one party? And he says he really hopes not. He's really committed to transparency in elections and integrity in elections, and he hopes that people will see that work is done in the next election.
Now, Todd, you've been looking at Delaware County. How did the election play out there? We've seen this was a county that for a long time been dominated by Republicans, but in 2017, Democrats began making inroads into the county government. What did you see happening there?
Well, I think this election in particular was a real test of their ability to have staying power, and they passed it, absolutely. I know we'll talk a little bit more about Delaware County in this show, but for me, it really just brings back to mind this old saying that Donald Trump put out there many years ago where he said he could shoot somebody on Broadway or whatever street it was and still, and his supporters wouldn't care. In Delaware County, we had 2 county council seats that were up for election. This was a county council that had put a 24% tax on its citizens the year before. You would have thought that would have stoked enough out, or at least I would have thought that would have stoked enough outrage to at least make those elections close. And they weren't really. And so, when I look at that and also some of the other outcomes from the collar counties, my takeaway was it looks like this surge in GOP registration that we've seen for the last couple of years, along with Trump's winning of Pennsylvania in 2024, it looks like the GOP again has they have traded away something here. In gaining those voters, these are low propensity voters, and it's very hard to turn them out in these off-year elections. The other couple of things that we were keeping an eye on at Broad and Liberty were this mess up in Chester County, where it looks like the wrong poll book was delivered. I would also say one other race that I was keeping my eye on because I had reported on it, not necessarily as an election, but in Chester County, the incumbent treasurer is a woman named Patricia Maizano, and I had reported previously that she boasts of 2 graduate degrees, which came from a diploma mill, and also that she's been credibly accused in other courts of having sort of financially abused elderly people who she was the guardian of. So, and this scandal apparently had almost no impact on her electability at all. And it just starts to feel to me like scandal is starting to just run off, it's like water off a duck's back of many politicians.
Charles, what types of issues did you see that voters were interested in this year's election?
Oh, I think the economy prevailed, that people were willing to nationalize issues down ballot at the hyper-local level. There's just this acuity of discontent statewide, and it answers to really these mercurial outcomes. That last year, for example, it was a good year for Republicans. This year, it was a great year for Democrats, in historic proportions in some areas of the state. And it's a reminder that Pennsylvania is not only home to the Obama to Trump voter at this point of a previous era. 2016 is over. We're a decade into the Trump the whole era. And now there are Trump voters who are willing to vote Democrat. And we saw that with this election because their concerns aren't answered by either party. They aren't beholden to either party. So it makes it hard to forecast next year in some sense, but optically, the Republican Party at this point, and considering Trump's approval numbers and that economic discontent, it led to this outcome.
Now, Rachel, you mentioned Mayor-elect O'Connor earlier. Now, in the spring, in the primary election, he defeated incumbent Mayor Ed Gainey. Where was the dissatisfaction with Mayor Gainey?
I'm sure. So I wasn't here really for the primaries. I was actually in Harrisburg, had a different job. But I think what I've heard about this race with Corey and O'Connor and Ed Gainey, I think there probably were very high expectations of Mayor Gainey, and he maybe fell victim to some of those expectations. There was a huge disagreement among city council and people in the city about inclusionary zoning, which is a policy by which you require developers to include a certain percentage of affordable housing in their developments. So I know that was a big disagreement. And there were also just, I think, accusations of just not running the city well. Corey O'Connor does come from sort of a political legacy. His father was mayor in the early 2000s, I believe. And so he may be seen as sort of a return to something, whereas Mayor Ed Gainey was viewed as more progressive, maybe a departure from the status quo.
Charles, one of the key issues that's impacting Pennsylvania's economy and how people are starting to think about the future are the development of data centers. And can you explain kind of what data centers are for and what kind of an impact is Pennsylvania starting to feel from them?
Well, I think the challenge of these data centers, people don't really understand what they are. And they're essential to this AI acceleration for cloud computing, for example, with the intensity of AI and how it is growing technologically. They're an essential source for capacity. And these campuses are proposed across the state. But if you follow any of the local stories, let's say in Middlesex Township in Cumberland County, for example, or in the Hazleton area, the level of opposition to this proposed form of economic development, which is really, in some sense, a succession to the warehousing and logistics that we saw in so many parts of the state in the past decade and a half, the level of opposition is intense. And we saw that just recently in Hazle Township, in the Hazleton area, where Project Hazelwood, which was touted by Governor Shapiro, was tabled for now because there are Republicans. This is MAGA country. Republicans living in these areas who are deeply opposed to these data centers not only because of let's say the quality of life concerns, their size, for example, but also environmental issues. And it's overlooked that there are Republicans in the state who are concerned about the environment, just as Democrats are customarily concerned about the environment. And that's cropping up as a top concern. So I think this issue is not going away, and it will figure as a major one in the midterms, where electricity prices are a concern. They're already going up in response to, let's say, the prospect, as a preemptive response to what has not yet happened, but appears inevitable in this Commonwealth.
Rachel, what are some of the environmental concerns regarding data centers?
They're huge energy users. We know that AI functions use more energy per entry. For example, a ChatGPT uses, I think, 10 times as much energy as a regular Google search. And so there's a lot more energy being used in these processes. And these data centers are being built to be massive. Now, there are already existing data centers. They haven't really piqued our interest in the same way that these so-called hyperscale data centers are going to. So they're massive warehouses, they're filled with computers, they need to be cooled, they need to run all the computers, they need a constant stream of electricity 24/7. So they have a huge, power hunger, and then they also use a lot of water. And that water is used directly and indirectly. The water is used to either cool through cooling systems. That water can evaporate in that process. But also the indirect use is that water is used in power plants through that process. And so there's even more water being used when you have to generate more energy, when you have to cool these big buildings. And then not necessarily environmental, but certainly a quality of life issue is the noise. I was actually at a meeting in Springdale, right outside of Pittsburgh last night, where residents there are facing the prospect of a big data center being placed right in town at the former site of the Cheswick power plant. And they're really concerned about the noise. They think it's going to drive them insane, that this humming is just going to take over their lives.
Todd, what are you seeing as far as concerns about data centers around the state?
Well, I think both Rachel and Charles have touched on it, that it's really not the data centers, it's the energy and the all of those issues. And I think what makes that so salient today is this is why Republicans are so excited about the permitting reform that they got in the budget. Because again, like I didn't mention this specifically when we briefly touched on the budget, but part of the new agreement is there will be a deemed approved process, where previously if you applied for a certain kind of environmental permit and you didn't get it, then it was deemed denied, or in essence you couldn't go forward. You were sort of in a purgatory. And so now if the permit decision doesn't reach you by a certain date, it's deemed approved and go ahead and go. And so again, that with the other streamlining aspects that Republicans think they've won, that I'm sure they have. But I think that's where this whole acceleration, that great word that he used, it really meets perfectly in line with the win that Republicans got in the last couple of days on the budget.
Rachel, you've written about House Bill 1834 and some of the regulatory aspects related to these data centers. What would this bill do, and what problem is it trying to solve?
That bill is trying to solve some of the problems with connecting massive users of electricity onto our existing power grid. And so there are some provisions in there that proposes having these data centers bring their own energy when they are built, instead of taking energy off the existing grid. And there's also a proposed protection in there for ratepayers by having these data centers, these large load users, pay into universal service programs or hardship programs, which are used to help lower income people struggling with their bills. Right now, Pennsylvania, those types of funds, those assistance programs, are only funded by residential customers. And so this bill would try to broaden that field and make those funds a little bit more solvent. That's one avenue that the legislature may take to try to regulate these data centers. The Public Utility Commission is also has put. Well, I think it is yet to be published, but they are considering what they call a model tariff that would be somewhat voluntary, be non-binding best practices for utilities to govern the connection of those data centers to their individual grids. And so that may include a different rate class, so that, large users are paying more for the electricity they use compared to residential or business customers. Perhaps paying for the transmission connection onto the grid. So there's several different ways that might be the way forward, but it may take a combination of things.
Charles, is there a sense of how the industry has been responding to some of these regulatory concerns?
I mean, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I mean, I have not been following this as closely. So, yeah.
Rachel, you quote Pennsylvania Utility Commission Chairman Stephen DeFrank. He says, "We have an iceberg coming towards us. We can't steer away from the iceberg if we don't know how big the iceberg is." That sounds pretty severe.
It does sound severe. Well, and because we don't really know how many of these data centers are going to be built, and we don't know how much energy they're going to use. So they are being proposed at this point, right? Every one that is proposed is not going to get built. So there is a danger in overbuilding the power grid to serve something that is not going to materialize. But then there's also a danger in not being properly prepared for the amount of power that is going to need to be used. And so one thing that the model tariff from the PUC, and also I believe that legislation in the House, is asking for more transparency, so that rates don't go up, that power isn't added to the grid until you're absolutely sure how much power each data center is going to use. So that type of transparency, and like, this is exactly how big it will be. This is how many, megawatts or gigawatts of electricity it's going to use. This is how much water it's going to use. There is a push for that transparency to know how the state and the grid at large needs to prepare for these centers.
Todd, you've been following policy in Delaware County. What are some of the key issues that they're dealing with? There was recently, over the past few years, a privatization of a county prison. What are some of the other things that are going on there?
Well, so the deprivatization has really been issue number one, but then like a lot of other counties, mainly in the Southeast, with a couple of other notable exceptions like Allegheny, most of those counties have always had their own health department, which, if you don't have a county health department, then essentially the state health department is your default. So, the Democrats, as you mentioned earlier, when they sort of got a toehold in 2017, then won a clean, unanimous sweep, in 2019. They campaigned on, we're going to deprivatize the prison, we're going to build a health department. I think this is a kind of a lesson in, there's this law called Hofstadter's law, which says it always takes longer than you think, even when you try to account for Hofstadter's law. And I think, that same principle kind of bit these Democrats. The projects that they wanted to initiate, they did, and, they kept their promises. But even if you're trying to account for budget overruns, your budget will will overrun even that. And so, what we saw with the deprivatization was the initial consultant, this consultant gave them a display of what he thought it would run up to. And he gave them three options of a 43 million, 47 million, or 49 million a year budget for the prison. And we're 3 years into the deprivatization era now, and we're running at 60 and a 60.5 million. So the other lesson of that is what the federal dollars, the ARPA dollars, have done to the county budget. It's hard to really suss out, but it looks like in a number of times, these dollars were used to create long-term projects or to pay for long-term employees, even though those dollars would only last 4 or 5 years. So in essence, it got the ball rolling on all of these things that the county only had the federal money to pay for in years 1 through 4, and now the county's scrambling to find a way to pay for that in all of these future years.
Now, the county also released its budget recently as well. Did you see anything in there that stood out for you?
That they're still using ARPA dollars, and ARPA is the American Rescue Plan Act. So it's one of the 20 or probably 2021. Charles is the encyclopedia. He knows these things. he pops his eyes when I said that to him. But I think it was the 2021 federal bill. So that, and also that the county's not yet able to start rebuilding its rainy day fund.
Now, Rachel, you covered recently Congresswoman Summer Lee held a town hall at the University of Pittsburgh. What types of topics did she bring up, and how did the students respond to her?
she brought up, basically the moment that we are in, right? There, she, and similarly, we should say very progressive, she's sort of on the left of her own party. But she was talking about threats to democracy and the fact that people have the power and people get to decide what type of a government we have, what type of an administration we have. And so there's a darkness in there. She said that we're already under an authoritarian administration with President Donald Trump, though she was trying to be, I think, inspiring to the students. It was a full room of students. But they had a lot of questions about, how does government work? How does, what's it like to be a congresswoman? What can you do as one congresswoman about immigration and customs enforcement and those types of raids that we were seeing in some communities? They had questions about the environment. They had questions about these data centers. And I will say, she doesn't have answers for everything, but she did, listen to them, and she really had an open discussion with, she's not shy with her thoughts. So she was very supportive of, protections for immigrants, of changing the dialogue about immigrants, of protecting the environment, of, looking forward on those types of issues, and then also trying to protect higher education and funding for higher education.
Todd, we're going to be looking at over the next week.
Just more budget fallout. I'm looking for how Republicans start to orient themselves after the loss, because I think they've spent the last week absorbing it and not really strategizing. Can I ask Rachel real quick? Rachel, like, if you were to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe is Summer Lee, do you think, next year?
I think she's probably like oh God, hard for me to say, really. Her district includes, Deep Blue Pittsburgh, but it does stretch out into Westmoreland County. So those types of suburbs and down into the Mon Valley, I think could it could depend. But she does make a pretty good show of being present in these communities and showing up for them. And so she's in her second term. Maybe she'll get a third. I would say she's better off than some, maybe, but I really couldn't give you a rating.
Gotcha. Charles, we only have a minute or two left. Give us a sense of now that this year's election is over, next year is a big gubernatorial election. What are you going to be looking for going into the next month or two?
So the Republican losses were profound, and we're entering a year where Pennsylvania arguably has, let's say, the highest number of toss-up seats at the congressional level in the country. So we have a governor's race plus the congressional races. It's going to be fascinating to follow. And really where the congressional races are unfolding are really in the regions where all the changes are occurring, and that led to, let's say, these swing outcomes from 24 to 25. It was a Republican year to a Democrat year. So the governor's race, Shapiro, Garrity, it could be more competitive than people anticipate, but Shapiro absolutely has the upper hand. The congressional races, Democrats may have the upper hand in certain seats, and that will be fascinating to follow, and we'll get a sense of the mood, let's say, in the next month or two. And of course, midterm elections historically favor the opposing party, with the party in power at the White House. So there could be surprises next year.
Our guests have been Charles McElwee, founding editor of RealClear, Pennsylvania, Todd Shepard, chief investigative reporter with Broad and Liberty, and Rachel McDevitt, a reporter with WESA-FM in Pittsburgh. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm Phil Beckman. Thank you for watching.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like the Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.